Now we're going to discuss a number of cultural phenomena that are going on in our age. One of the things that's happened for me being involved in this work, talking with so many people that are drawn into the demonic through various means, is I've started to watch culture, both the mainstream and the fringe, with a different eye and notice the trends. Our kids, our young people, in fact all of us, the adults also, are growing up and living in a world that I think is becoming more and more explicitly occult. What used to be veiled behind the various trappings or some excuse or some allegory for evil is now becoming more explicitly evil. One of the places that we can look is in the literature that youths read. It can be very edifying to go to the book section of a mainstream outlet, the most mainstream and commercial, and look at the youth book section. We've had a spate of a number of years where vampires had become very trendy, and of course they've always been trendy since Bram Stoker wrote his book. Just a side note, by the way, for the people that have never actually read the book Dracula, it is a very Catholic book, and explicitly Van Helsing uses the host to drive back the vampires. And the reason for Dracula's existence that is given by Bram Stoker in his book is that this count came from a family of devil worshippers that had made a commitment that every 11th generation, the person in the family line would be possessed by the devil, which is what the vampire was in the book. Most people haven't actually read the book, so I wanted to share that. But what we're seeing in our culture, in our age, is this fascination with the occult, with modified humans, people that have become vampires, and this alien additional aspect has come into them that used to be scary and evil, but is now glamorized as something attractive and intriguing and complex and perhaps sexy. Well, I think there's been a shift, because if you look at our current books, there's more and more books about explicitly demons being sympathetic characters, about people that are possessed by demons being sympathetic characters, the idea of redemption for these demons, that relating with them is something desirable, that they themselves, instead of being veiled behind the idea of a vampire, it's now just a demon as a sympathetic character, something attractive to be interested in. In addition to this, I think there's also a trend with younger and younger people being taught that the idea of magic and consorting with creatures and spirits is a normal and fun and interesting thing to do. I think it's a mistake to pick on all literature that might have fanciful parts or magic in it and say that it's all demonic and all evil. I think sometimes it's just stories, and there are just natural parts of culture. But what we're seeing now, I think, is a more systematic and more overtly demonic version of that. In addition, you can also look at the social events for young people. Not so much in this country, but in Northern Europe right now, and there are some touring events, these outdoor music festivals that are very large, 20, 30, 50, 70,000 people at a time. Some of them are still a bit veiled, but very occult, with creatures and whatnot being the symbols that are used, but inviting relationship with them. And then there's one festival in particular in Northern Europe, and it's called Climax, but it's spelled with a Q at the beginning. You can go on YouTube and watch videos about this. You will be shocked. It is like an 8 or 9 hour long event with 20 or 30,000 young people in frenzied dancing for that entire time. And the interludes between the performers and the songs that they play, which are very fast driving songs, are explicit demonic indoctrination with devil heads speaking, and not in kind of a more cheesy, kind of funny way. This is presented as very serious, inviting the people to open their minds to spirits, to let the spirits into them, telling them that they're going to go deeper into their demonic relationship at this event than they did at the last year's event. And it's been going on for a number of years and getting more explicitly evil each time. So there's a number of places like that where we see the kingdom of hell, in a sense, being presented with less veils, in front of it. Now, we see some struggles in our culture today that I think are a little more political, where the Church of Satan wants to put up statues in a particular place or wants the Ten Commandments removed unless they can put something up, and there's freedom of religion issues. Those are probably more political, but they also let you know that they're pushing. So I don't have children or a wife because you really can't when you're involved in this work, and that's okay with me. If I were a parent right now, I think I would want to educate my children as much as I could about the truth of things once they were old enough to understand it, because some of the evil is veiled and is designed to seduce, to lure, to be interesting, and then later might be revealed as more explicitly evil. I think since free will is central to the struggle with the demonic, whether it be in temptation when we resist sin, or whether it be in these more extreme cases that we've talked about, since that free will of the child, especially once they're of the age of reason, is central, I don't know if it's always going to be the best to just try to shield them and hide all of this from them. I think perhaps educating them on the truth of it so they understand it before they encounter it and are maybe lured into it. An open sharing when they're old enough to understand these things and not be scandalized or overly scared of them, but let them know that that reality is there. I would think for myself would be a way I would approach it. I think it's important to pay attention to what's going on in your time and in your place, your part of the country or the world, and what's going on in your culture, because these forces come and go in terms of how much they manifest in a culture. We've had times here in the United States where in the 60s there was a lot of Eastern mysticism coming in and things were being veiled in those types of systems. But then it turned out, later that these weren't just words people were chanting, but they were the names of deities, but they weren't told that at the time. There's been different examples like that where I think we have to be prudent in embracing something and just taking it in. Another area that I find a little bit concerning is yoga, and I know a lot of people engage in that, and in terms of just a physical exercise, it's stretching and breathing, and that's not necessarily bad. But we have to understand where it comes from. A lot of things in the United States are bits of religious systems that are taken out of context and then embraced. And so the physical postures in yoga is only one part of a whole lifestyle of religion that involves diet, prayer, religious exercises, chanting the names of deities, while in these poses that are associated with those deities. So in its proper original context, this wasn't just stretching and exercising. That's not what it was designed for. These were physical postures that were associated with particular devotional or worship-related activities. So we take them out of context, and I think it's good to just be aware. We have a tendency to, in this country, kind of embrace and explore bits coming from other systems, and we do this generation after generation. And to an extent, that's okay to look at those things as they are here, but dig a little deeper before you embrace it. Observe that it's going on. Notice that it's part of our culture. It's become part of our culture. But before you embrace it, particularly, for instance, if you look into the Kundalini part of yoga, there's an idea within the yogic systems of quote-unquote raising the Kundalini, which is what? It's a serpent that lives at the base of the spine in the person, and that if you activate the Kundalini or excite this serpent at the base of your spine, this energy will go up your spine, and if it reaches your head, will cause all kinds of altered states. This can be YouTubed and looked into. This includes involuntary movements of the body, twitching, barking noises coming out of the person, involuntary vocalizations, falling on the floor, writhing, a lot of things like that. Often this is done through the laying on of hands of somebody who has already activated their Kundalini spirit in themselves. So I'm not passing judgment on yoga or these systems. I'm giving you these examples that you can go research yourself and verify as examples of a system that's been embraced in the United States, taken out of context, but is actually part of a larger system that includes things that, if you looked at the whole, would be very scary, I think, to most Christians and to most Christian parents. Now, another aspect of, in fact, all human cultures is that of drugs and alcohol. Drugs and alcohol have been with us forever, and they will always be there. But I think it's particularly important to think a little bit about the possible spiritual impact of drugs and alcohol. In a lot of older cultures, drugs were used to induce spiritual states, so to speak, or to make one predisposed to communicating with spiritual entities. We can see this in the popularity of ayahuasca, this plant in South America that a lot of Americans travel down there to do these rituals and drink this. Some Native American groups here in the States drink this, and it basically induces visions and hallucinations. It's a neurotoxin, poisons the body and induces hallucinations. There's a lot of vomiting involved because the body rejects it as a poison. But it's been used for a long time in indigenous cultures, and it's becoming popular here. In our culture, we have a number of drugs that are currently legal that kids are able to obtain that induce these very radical spiritual experiences, not genuine spiritual, but hallucinatory, and possibly genuinely spiritual in a negative sense. There's spice. There is a plant that they can acquire legally from these shops, kind of head shops that sell these type of products. They smoke it. It induces a 5 to 10 minute very strong hallucinatory experience, often negative. You can go on YouTube and search out what these products are called. In many cases, from watching these videos of the experiences, they seem to be seeing spirits. Now, it could just be hallucinations, but in some of the cases, they're absolutely terrified by what they're seeing, shrieking and running away from it, and that could be just a quote-unquote bad trip, like acid in the 60s sometimes people would have, but it's very dangerous. Some of them, like with the bath salts, can induce permanent damage in the brain, and of course that's a concern regardless of demonic issues for parents. But we need to be aware that one of the things going on with drugs and alcohol is that as the free will, which we've repeatedly highlighted, is central to the struggle with demonic forces and with spirituality in general, the choice between God or other, the free will and the ability to choose and say, I don't like this experience that's going on right now, or this doesn't feel right to me, I reject it, is reduced when somebody is very drunk or impaired on drugs. It's no coincidence that a lot of satanic covens and groups and occult groups that indoctrinate kids use alcohol and usually drugs as part of the ritual process, particularly early on when they're getting into it, so that their judgment is impaired, but also, I believe, so that their spiritual kind of protection and grace through their free will choices to resist is impaired. And so there's more and more influence coming into their lives and possibly entering their body when they combine the drugs and alcohol with occult rituals. Drinking alone in moderation for many people is not a problem, of course, but drinking a lot, and particularly mixing that with occult practices or religious exploration, or certainly with depression, would be a warning sign for people. I think that we're living in an age where parents may not realize the extent of the legal drugs that are available to kids that are very strong. And basically what's going on is these companies are changing them enough chemically that they're technically a new drug. And so as fast as the lawmakers outlaw one drug, they've changed one molecule or one part of that molecule, and now it's a different thing, and they can continue to sell it under a different name without any regard for what it's doing to people's brains or their spirituality. So now that we've discussed a number of negative things that are in the world that we can help shield our children from or educate them about so they can make those good choices and avoid them, what are some of the positive steps that you can take in your home and in your family? Well, first off, family prayer, praying together and praying for each other. Seems simple, it's said very frequently, but it has a tremendous impact. One of the advantages of working in exorcism is you get to see the impact of prayer in the response of the devil and see how incredibly powerful prayer is. Though, of course, sometimes we experience that in our lives, thanks be to God, and we see the impact of prayer in amazing ways, miracles happening for people in the world. But I think it's easy to fall into a sense of you pray, but you're not sure what's happening there. But I think praying together is actually very important. I think parents need to remember that they have a special authority and grace from God to bless their children, and that you should bless your children every night, every day. I think keeping sacramentals in the home is important, and the sacramental life for your kids is very important. Just avoiding evil is not enough, but helping them make the choice for God, and helping to ensure that it's a real free will choice, that they've thought about it and they're deciding, they're not just following what they're told to say or do, is very important, because once they're of the age of reason, part of it is between them and God and their free will in their heart, as opposed to what they might do to make other people happy. Now, I'm going to give an example of a family and an interaction with a child in a family that did lead to some bad outcomes. Now, I'm not picking on this family or the parenting that they did. I think some of this was out of ignorance for sure. I don't think there was any malice in this family, and nor is there now. There was a young girl who was a teenager. She wasn't 18 yet, who had what appeared to be psychic sensitivity her whole life. This seemed to run in the family and the women in the family. The mother had some of this, and previous generation in the family did too. And this seemed to amount to sometimes seeing spirits, sometimes hearing them, knowing things that were going to happen. And this crops up in people's lives in different ways and places. Usually I think it's deception or misunderstanding. I don't really believe in psychic powers unto themselves. I think things either come from God or from the enemy. I don't know yet that I feel comfortable with the idea of humans having these quote-unquote gifts that are just exercised all the time. I think it has to come from God or the devil. But in any case, this young person went on one of these TV shows that kind of celebrates children with psychic abilities, tries to work with them or maybe give them information, coaching from an adult who also claims to have psychic abilities in their lives, and I think a therapist to maybe work with the child and the family to help them adjust to this. So in this particular case, the young lady, she's now a young lady, the child at the time did this TV show, filmed it, no real incidents. The evening that the show aired, they went under full possession in the living room on the floor in front of the family at the end of the episode airing that they were all watching to see her on TV. It turned out that what was providing the psychic impressions was a demon that was in her. How exactly it got there, we don't know. Whether it was staying in the family, we don't know. This was a devout Christian family, but they had a limited understanding of these supposed psychic impressions and what they may mean. So this child, we had a number of prayer sessions with them, and they were freed for a little while, and then it seemed that there was some additional spirits there. It was very clear that she was possessed. She went under full possession states, but luckily she was freed within a couple months. But it was a very difficult time for her and the family, and I think it was a real wake-up call that allowing and even fostering the idea of psychic or spiritual powers in a child could lead to disastrous consequences Now, in this case, it was probably already there and providing them, but perhaps by celebrating them and seeking fame or attention or money through the exploitation of these tricks that it turns out a demon was doing was maybe not a wise way to go. Now, the good fruit that came from this, and that almost always comes out of these cases when God intervenes through the church, through prayer, is that great fruit came from it. There was great insight and growth, and hopefully, their story and her experience will help other people at some point along the way. So, not to be denigrating about families that seem to have psychic sensitivity running in them. I know a lot of people believe in that. And I'm not saying that it absolutely can't exist, that there can't be a gift from God in some way that looks like that. But I think we have to be extremely cautious when something unusual is happening, that we not accept it too readily and run with it. And particularly when somebody's young and they're having strange experiences, to too readily attribute that to being good or neutral and encouraging it in a child, I think could be very dangerous. I think, of course, you want to rule out medical causes, psychological causes. Many children seek attention, and they want attention badly from adults. And if they see on TV or in movies that this type of behavior gets attention, and maybe it's a big family and they're not getting a lot of attention and it's a way to draw it to themselves, there's many things to consider there. But in cases where something seems to really genuinely be going on, some unusual manifestation is going on around a child, to kind of allow them to run with it or even encourage it without seeking proper spiritual oversight and discernment about that, I think, can lead to problems. In this case, she was freed, and so there wasn't any serious long-term outcome spiritually. But I think it's a story that's worth sharing with parents because I think it's sobering. So now that we've covered a number of things that can be done or should be avoided or should be approached cautiously, I just want to close by reminding you that when we understand God and God's rules and we're taking the guidance of the church and we're living the sacramental life, we don't need to be afraid of these things. Yes, they're out there in the world. But if you're living a good life and you're living a life seeking God, we don't need to live in fear of these things. We need to understand the enemy and understand what is out there in the world. But if we're living right and living close to God, we don't need to be unduly worried about it. So with that said, raise your children in joy and security and raise them in the church. So in our next segment, we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in our generation, in our time, in the ministry of exorcism in the church.